So what is QAPP? QAPP is a program that we developed. I started off on this job helping tribes write QAPPs, and I developed, I think I had 13 or 14 different templates for QAPPs that were just long Word documents, some of them close to 100 pages long. And what I found is that what people tended to do is just do a global find and replace the material that was generic, like Melinda's office, for the tribal office name with their information, and it really wasn't making a QAPP a useful document at all, and in fact could be sort of a dangerous document, because one thing that has to be done to an approved QAPP is that it's signed. And if people are committing to doing things that are described in their QAPP that are really not appropriate for their project, that just makes the whole thing a big waste of time. So over the years, I've written a lot of QAPPs, and I, like anybody who's written one, has been frustrated with the 24-element system. So I put all the text and all the EPA recommendations from Red Book documents, from instrument manufacturers, from state and county QAPPs that I got a hold of into the text that is in this program, and the programming was done by Lakes Environmental, and it's basically a series of screens that walk you through entering information. So once you enter the information of the name of your tribe and your department, it then writes it in, this information, in the maybe 40 or 50 places in the completed QAPP. So it tries to eliminate a lot of the tedium associated with writing a QAPP. The other thing that it does is it doesn't go in order. A QAPP ideally is documenting the planning process for you, the people in the field, maybe if you're working with a laboratory, if you're working with a funding agency such as EPA, how you plan, what measurements you're going to take, where, why, and what you're going to do with them. And so that really could end up with a great QAPP that is useful to you. A lot of times you've already started making the measurements, or you've already decided on where you're going to place your monitor, and that's fine. And in that case, a QAPP can be useful to you as a one-stop shop. So all of your requirements, your references to SOPs, or the SOPs themselves are appended, the requirements for your QC checks, for frequency, for maintaining your instruments, that can all be documented in the QAPP, and it can really end up being something that you refer to and pull pages out of that is useful to you throughout the length of the project. And a good starting point whenever you're going to spend any money and make measurements is, why are we making these measurements? What are we going to do with this data? What questions do we have about our environment that we want this information to answer? And so the QAPP program is written to start off with asking that question, and then everything follows from that. So you first enter in some basic information in the first screens, and one of the most important is what category of QAPP you're writing. If you are making measurements to compare against a standard, that's a Category 1 project that requires you to include all 24 elements. When you're just starting out writing a QAPP, until you get to this screen, this navigation panel over here on the left is blank, because it doesn't know, well, maybe she's just writing a QAPP for education and outreach, and EPA considers that a Category 4 QAPP, so only some of the elements are needed, because the instrumentation is just going to be used for going around and educating people at schools. So until you get to this screen, this navigation panel over here on the left is blank, but we're doing measurements. I'm doing an example, PM10 QAPP using a TEOM. to compare against the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. So that's a Category 1 project. So I click Next, and this next screen says, okay, what are you measuring? And our funding has been just from the EPA's air department. So we have all the criteria pollutants for air monitoring, including somewhat of a breakdown for continuous and filter-based methods. And then we also have other, and there's two categories of other types of measurements. There's measurements that require you to take samples and send them to a laboratory for analysis. And of course, that requires additional information in your QAPP because what the laboratory does directly impacts the validity of your data. So you can change this from other, which doesn't make much sense, to whatever it is that you are analyzing for. I'm going to say cancel. And the other category is where you've got instrumentation on site and it's producing data, or you even have a handheld monitor and you're going around doing analyses such as like a turbidity meter or something like that, where you're doing analyses and taking records in a logbook and a field data sheet, and in that case you could enter that pollutant here. Once you decide what pollutant you're monitoring for, it asks you how many monitors do you have. We are a small program and we only have one TO monitor, so I'm going to say I've got one there. And you can see really basic information is asked at the beginning. How many sites are there where you're going to be measuring this pollutant? And you can see here that we have suggested text. So this is text that I've put together that may be totally adequate just as it is. But you have to read it and make sure that it is suitable for your program. And until you make this button go black instead of purple, TurboQAPP says, nope, she hasn't really read it, so I'm not going to count this as being a done element until you click Accept. And as soon as you click Accept and move on to the next element, you can see that some of the areas are green. So that would be one where I have said the number of sites. I've accepted this example text, and now I know that I'm done with that element. Or at least I've put in some work into it. And now I say Next, and now we get into some more information like the problem definition, problem background, and then here we get into some of the places where TurboQAPP is really useful for you. For any of the criteria pollutants, we have all the designated FRM and FEM methods. There may be a few that have recently been accepted by EPA, and we've got their designation numbers and method codes. The few that may have been recently accepted by EPA, we may not have them in here, but you can always add a method with a designation number and code if you have one that's just been recently added. Information like scale of representativeness, and you can see that we've got tips. So down here, here's a hyperlink linking to an EPA page that talks about the list of reference and equivalent methods. So we've got links and information on almost all of the pages. We have pop-ups. So what is this scale of representativeness? Micro, middle, neighborhood, urban, regional? What do those mean? If you click on this link, it opens up a Word document, which is basically just an excerpt from 40 CFR 58 Appendix E, I think. Oh, excuse me, Appendix D. And it gives you a lot of information that then you can look at and decide, okay, my scale of representativeness is neighborhood. And you can click that button and then continue on. So we have all this information that's in these text boxes. You can copy and paste documents into it. So for example, if you've got paragraphs from your grant application that describe something that you want to put in here, you can just copy that and directly paste it into these text boxes. And if you decide, oh man, I don't want any of that, that is not appropriate, the description of work to be performed, whatever we think is appropriate is the work. And you say, yeah, that's what I want to do. And then you think, maybe I need a little bit more detail there. So I want that example back. And it brings the example back and it just appends it to the end of what you wrote in there. So then you can meld the two or add to what you've written. So that's the way the program works in general. You can navigate back and forth. If you're working on more than one pollutant, you would select that in the drop-down box. I only have one that I'm working on right now, and that allows you to not have to write a whole separate QAPP in terms of the site information and your organization description and information like that you won't have to copy and paste between two different QAPPs. But at the end, you can actually generate two QAPPs for the different pollutants with the same information that's duplicated in both that's appropriate. So really, there's some areas of a QAPP that always just really give people lots of headaches and stump them. And one of them is the data quality objectives process. And we can make this navigation tree a little smaller. And this is one of the best things about the QAPP project. The data quality objectives process is a 7-step process, and it is designed to help you figure out what you want to measure and why. And it leads you through and asks you questions like stating the problem. State your problem in a few sentences. And I have example text here. We have a lot of increased asthma. And it may be that you don't like any of this information and you want to put in your own text. The data quality objectives process is basically just a documented planning process. So if you go through these 7 tabs, which relate to this element 7, and the purpose of this air monitoring effort is to determine why we are getting sick. Okay, well that isn't really a decision. Let me go back and see what the example was. And now I'm going to accept this. And if you go through these different steps with these 7 tabs and add information or accept what's there, then you have completed the data quality objectives process. How great is that? So this is one of the things that I'm most proud of about QAPP. Specifying tolerable limits on decision errors. What does that mean? And it's got an explanation of that and says basically in some of these tougher areas, if you're monitoring using an FRM or an FEM for a criteria pollutant, EPA has said how you're going to do the measurements, and that will limit your decision errors. But you may want to look up more information about that. So again, there are links. So these pull up different EPA pages. This is the quality system documents page, so all sorts of things that you can download and read. Data quality objectives, that sounds weird. I want to know more information about that. And so you click on that, and we've embedded resource files. So like this is a PowerPoint presentation on the data quality objectives process that is from EPA's Office of Information Management, they're called now. They used to be just like the Quality Assurance Department or something like that in DC. So we have a lot of different useful links here. If we go back and pull out the navigation tree, you can see that we don't go in order, but in the end, and at any point if you want to print out what you've done so far or export it to a Word document, it reassembles the elements in correct order. And obviously any of these that are red and you haven't worked on them yet, those are just going to be headers in anything that you produce at this point. Data quality indicators, so really great stuff like precision. And then you talk about precision in general, and that there's another link here about definitions. Um, but what does this mean in terms of my TEOM? And so I've got specific text in here that applies to doing continuous PM10 monitoring and how precision applies to that particular measurement, because depending upon whether you're making many measurements with a similar piece of equipment or you've only got one piece of equipment, how are you going to measure precision? So we've got information about these different statistics that are used, and whenever any information in the text boxes is in all caps, um, that means please review this carefully, and it stays in caps until you actually type over it because I want to make sure that it really is appropriate for your project. So as you go through, you just keep clicking next, and it goes through, and some of the stuff at the end is some of the most boring, but yet really important. Like, well, there's the title and approval sheet. That's important, definitely boring, but documents and records. Oh man, where are we going to keep all this information? So I've got tables in here, and you can edit these tables with all the different information you might ever want to keep about your program and who's going to be in charge of filing it and where it's going to go. But if you don't like this setup, you can delete this entire table. And at any point when you realize, oh, it's time for lunch, or my head is beginning to explode, you can exit out of QAPP, and it saves your data. It basically constructs a database of all these different pages and tables, and like any other database, it saves it automatically as soon as you move on to the next screen, except for those example texts, and you have to click that purple button to make it turn black before it knows you've really reviewed it. So you say, okay, I can't take this any longer. I'm going to click X. Do you really want to close QAPP? You say yes, and then it is saved. So that's just an overview of what QAPP is, and then I have other podcasts that go into more detail about the tables and how to manipulate them, and also producing reports.